Somewhere in the canyon country, a gauge on the wall of a great dam reports a number, updated every day. The elevation of the water behind it measured to the fraction of a foot, and that single number quietly governs the fate of tens of millions of people spread across 2 nations and thousands of miles. Most of them have never heard of it. A family in a desert suburb, watering a lawn on a summer evening, has no idea that the water in their hose traces back through 100 miles of canal and a chain of reservoirs to that falling number on that distant wall. A city on the coast, a farm in the borderlands, a resort in the desert, all of them are downstream in one way or another of that gauge. And all of them are living on the assumption that the number will hold. But the number is not holding. It has been falling for years, and it has now fallen to the lowest point in the entire history of the reservoir, and as it approaches the lines below which the dam can no longer do its job, the people downstream are about to discover, in a specific and unforgiving order, just how much of their lives depended on a number they never knew existed. This is the story of that order, and of the 8 cities standing closest to the front of it. Lake Powell does not really fail all at once, and it does not fail everywhere at the same time. When people imagine the second largest reservoir in the United States failing, they picture a single catastrophic moment. A day when the water simply runs out and everyone who depends on it goes dry together. But that is not how it works, and understanding why is the key to everything that follows. Because Lake Powell is not primarily a reservoir that cities drink from directly. It is a bank, an enormous account of stored water sitting high in the canyon country of the upper Colorado River Basin. And its main job is to release water downstream through the Glen Canyon Dam onto Lake Mead and the great cities and farms of the lower basin below. So when Powell fails, when it drops so low that it can no longer generate power, and then lowers still to the point where it can barely release water at all, the failure does not strike every city at once. It travels. It moves through the system in a specific order, determined by geography and by a century of law that decides in advance who loses their water first and who loses it last. There is a line, in other words, and some cities are at the front of it. This is the story of the 8 that are closest to the front, the cities that lose their water first when Lake Powell fails. Before we count them down, you have to understand what failing actually means for Lake Powell, because there are 2 distinct thresholds, and they matter enormously to the order of who is affected. The first threshold is minimum power pool, the elevation, around 3,490 feet, below which the water sitting behind Glen Canyon Dam is too low to spin the dam's turbines, so that the dam stops generating electricity. That is the first kind of failure, the loss of the power, and it affects millions of people across many states who receive electricity from the dam, though it is a failure of power rather than of water. The second and deeper threshold is dead pool, around 3,370 feet. The elevation below, which the water falls beneath the openings that let it pass through the dam at all, so that Powell can no longer release water downstream even if it wanted to. That is the true failure, the catastrophic one, because it means the flow of water from the upper basin to the lower basin, the flow that fills Lake Mead and sustains the cities and farms below, simply stops. And here is what makes this moment so urgent, because Lake Powell has been falling toward those thresholds for years, and in the most recent period has plunged to the lowest level in its entire history, closer to those lines than it has ever been, with the people who manage it now speaking openly about the approach of dead pool. So the failure we are describing is not a distant hypothetical. It is a process already well underway, and the only real questions are how far it goes and who it reaches, and in what order. And there is a whole dimension of the failure that arrives before the water crisis even reaches its worst, which is the loss of the power. And it is worth pausing on because it widens the circle of who is affected far beyond the 8 cities we are about to count. Glen Canyon Dam is not only a plug that holds back and releases water. It is a major hydroelectric power station. Its turbines spinning out electricity that flows to millions of people across a wide swath of the West, to homes and towns and rural cooperatives and tribal communities spread across several states. Much of it relatively cheap, clean, flexible power that helps hold the regional grid together. When Lake Powell falls below minimum power pool, that generation stops, and all of those customers must find their electricity elsewhere, almost certainly at higher cost and with less of the instant, grid-stabilizing flexibility that hydropower uniquely provides. So the first threshold of Powell's failure, the loss of the power, sends its own shock through the region. A blow to millions who may not lose a drop of water, but who feel the failure in their electricity bills and in the growing strain on their grid. This power failure comes at a higher lake level than the water failure, which means it arrives first, a warning bell ringing across the West that the reservoir has entered its endgame, even before the deeper catastrophe of the water itself begins to bite. So let us count down the 8 cities at the front of the line, beginning with the one that is closest of all, the one that loses its water not through any long chain of consequences, but directly and immediately, because it drinks straight from the lake itself. That city is Page, Arizona. Page sits right on the shore of Lake Powell, a town that was literally built to construct the Glen Canyon Dam and then stayed, and it draws its drinking water directly out of the reservoir, its intake reaching down into the same water that the dam holds back. This makes Page uniquely and immediately vulnerable, because it does not depend on Powell releasing water downstream, or on any allocation or priority or legal right. It depends on the simple physical fact that its intake pipe must remain underwater. As the lake drops, that intake sits closer and closer to the falling surface, and if the reservoir descends far enough, the town's own water intake can be left high and dry, above the waterline, unable to draw anything at all. Page is therefore the first to feel it. Not because of any law, but because of pure geography, a town perched on a shrinking lake, watching the water it drinks recede toward and potentially past the mouth of its own pipe. And Page is not alone up there, because the surrounding area includes communities of the Navajo Nation, people who have often been last in line for water infrastructure and who share the same acute. Direct exposure to the falling reservoir. Page and its neighbors are the front of the front, the ones for whom Powell failing is not an abstraction, traveling down a distant system, but the water at their own tap disappearing as the lake beneath their town drains away. And Page has already been watching the warning signs for years, written on the walls of the canyon around it. The reservoir it lives beside has become a landscape of retreat, marinas left stranded far from the water, boat ramps ending in dry rock, the famous houseboats in the tourism economy that sustains the town increasingly stranded as the lake pulls back into its deepening canyons. For a town whose economy runs on the reservoir, on the visitors who come to boat and fish and marvel at the water in the desert, the shrinking of Powell is already a slow economic wound, quite apart from the drinking water threat. And that double exposure, a town whose livelihood and whose tap both depend on the same falling lake, makes Page the purest example of what it means to live directly on a failing reservoir. Its prosperity draining away with the water even before its intake is threatened. When people look for the first place that Lake Powell's failure becomes real, They do not need to trace long chains of law and infrastructure. They need only look at the town on its shore, watching the water it drinks and the water it lives on recede month by month toward the mouth of its own pipe. The front of the line made visible in stranded boats and lengthening beaches of bare rock. The second city in the line moves us from the direct to the indirect, from the shore of Powell to the vast web of consequences that its failure sets loose downstream, and it is the largest and most important city in the whole story, Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix does not drink from Lake Powell directly. It sits far to the south in the desert of central Arizona, and it receives a large share of its water from the Colorado River through an enormous canal system, the Central Arizona Project, that lifts the water hundreds of miles across the desert from the river. And here the chain of failure becomes clear, because that canal draws its water from Lake Mead, and Lake Mead is filled in large part by the releases that come down from Lake Powell. So when Powell fails, and those releases shrink or stop, Mead falls faster, and the water available to the canal that serves Phoenix shrinks with it. But there is a second, crueler layer, which is the matter of priority, the legal order that decides who loses water first when the river runs short. When the framework for sharing the Colorado was written, Arizona agreed. In exchange for getting its canal built, to hold a junior priority, meaning that when cuts must be made, this canal that serves Phoenix and central Arizona is among the very first to lose water, and loses it in the largest proportions. So Phoenix is doubly exposed, its Colorado supply both dependent on the failing releases from Powell and legally first in line to be cut when the river is short. Phoenix is not going to have every tap run dry the instant Powell fails, because it has other sources, the local rivers and its groundwater, and it is one of the more sophisticated water managers in the country. But the Colorado portion of its supply, a large and vital share, is among the most exposed in the entire basin. First, to be cut by law and dependent on the very releases that Powell's failure would choke off, which places this desert metropolis of millions very near the front of the line. And the cuts are not a future scenario for central Arizona, because they have already begun, the leading edge of the failure already cutting into the canal that serves Phoenix. As the Colorado shortage deepened, the junior priority that Arizona accepted long ago came due, and the deliveries through that canal were reduced. The cuts falling first and hardest on the farmers of central Arizona, whose fields were among the first to be dried up as their share of the river was taken away and reserved for the cities. That was the system working exactly as written, the most junior users losing their water first. And it was a preview of what deeper cuts would mean as they climbed from the farms toward the cities themselves. Phoenix sits at the center of one of the fastest growing regions in the country, still adding people and houses and thirsty industry even as this vital pillar of its water supply is cut back. A metropolis expanding into the teeth of a shrinking river. It has genuine strengths, its local rivers, its banked groundwater, its sophisticated management, and it will not be the first to run dry. But the Colorado share it stands to lose is enormous, and it is losing it already, which makes this desert giant, for all its resources, one of the most consequential names near the front of the line. The third city carries the same Arizona vulnerability, but in an even more concentrated form, because it has leaned even harder on the Colorado River water that Powell's failure threatens, and that city is Tucson. Tucson, in the southern Arizona desert, made a remarkable bet decades ago. Having overdrawn its groundwater for years, it turned to the Central Arizona Project Canal, the same canal that serves Phoenix, and it began taking its share of Colorado River water and, rather than using it all directly, recharging much of it into the ground, banking it in the aquifer beneath the city, storing the river's water underground as a savings account against the future. It was a genuinely far-sighted strategy, and it made Tucson deeply dependent on that Colorado supply. Because the renewable water that refills its underground savings and reduces its reliance on mining ancient groundwater comes down that same canal from that same Lake Mead, fed by those same releases from Lake Powell. So Tucson, like Phoenix, holds the junior priority that puts it first in line for cuts, and it has built a water strategy around a Colorado supply that Powell's failure would directly imperil. The city has its banked groundwater to fall back on, a real buffer that many places lack, but that buffer was always meant to bridge shortages, not to replace a permanently vanished river. And if the Colorado deliveries collapse because Powell can no longer feed Mead, Tucson faces the erosion of the very foundation of its long-term water security, another Arizona city near the front of the line, because it drinks, indirectly but heavily, from the water that Powell releases. Tucson's underground savings account is real, and it is the thing that distinguishes the city. But it is worth understanding its limits, because a buffer can create a dangerous illusion of safety. The banked water beneath Tucson was accumulated over years of taking more Colorado water than the city immediately needed and storing the surplus underground. And it represents a genuine cushion, years of supply held in reserve against a shortage. But that cushion was filled by the very Colorado deliveries that Powell's failure threatens, which means that once the deliveries shrink, the city is no longer adding to its savings, but only drawing them down, spending a finite reserve that it can no longer replenish. A savings account that receives no more deposits and only withdrawals has a bottom. And the more the city leans on it to cover the vanishing river, the faster it approaches that bottom. So Tucson's foresight has bought it time, more time than most of its neighbors have, and that is not nothing. But time is not the same as a solution, and if the Colorado deliveries collapse for good because Powell can no longer feed Mead, then Tucson's cushion becomes a countdown. A measured reserve draining toward the day when the underground savings run low and the city, having exhausted its clever bridge, confronts the same shortfall as everyone else, only later. The fourth city sharpens the picture in a different way, because it shows that being wealthy and well-appointed offers no exemption from the arithmetic of the river, and that city is Scottsdale, Arizona. Scottsdale is one of the more affluent cities in the region, a place of golf courses and resorts and prosperous neighborhoods. And it too draws heavily on Colorado River water delivered through the Central Arizona Project Canal. It sits under the same junior priority, dependent on the same threatened deliveries, and it offers a preview, already glimpsed in reality, of what the front of the line can look like. Because on the very edge of the Scottsdale area, a community that had relied on water hauled in from the city found itself cut off when the drought deepened and the city moved to protect its own supply, leaving households in an affluent corner of a major metropolitan area suddenly scrambling for water, rationing, paying dearly for trucked-in supplies, fighting over who was responsible for keeping their taps flowing. That episode was a small, local foretaste of the larger reckoning, a demonstration that when the Colorado supply tightens, even wealthy and sophisticated places are not immune, that the water can be pulled out from under the prosperous just as it can from the poor. Scottsdale stands on the list, not because it is uniquely fragile, but because it is uniquely instructive. A reminder that the front of the line is not defined by poverty, but by dependence on the river, and that money does not move a city out of the path of the failing water. The Rio Verde episode deserves to be remembered in detail, because it is the closest thing we have to a live rehearsal of what the front of the line feels like for ordinary people. On the fringe of the Scottsdale area, a community of homes had grown up in the unincorporated desert without its own secured water supply, relying for years on water trucked in and purchased from the nearby city. And when the drought forced that city to look hard at its own supply, it decided it could no longer spare the water, and it cut the haulers off, leaving hundreds of households in a wealthy corner of a major American metropolis suddenly without a reliable source of water. People who had assumed water was a settled fact of life found themselves rationing every drop, hunting for supplies trucked from further and further away at climbing prices, their property values thrown into doubt, their daily lives consumed by the scramble for a resource they had never before had to think about. It became a bitter, prolonged fight over who was responsible for supplying them, a small crisis that drew national attention precisely because it was so startling, and it stands as a warning that when the water tightens, the comfortable are not spared. That the same dependence on the shrinking river that threatens the poor reaches into the gated neighborhoods and the resort towns just as surely. The fifth city takes us out of Arizona and across the desert to Nevada, to a city whose very existence in the desert is a kind of dare against the water, Las Vegas. The Las Vegas area, home to the great majority of Nevada's population, draws the overwhelming share of its water, on the order of 90%, from a single source, Lake Mead, into which it dips a set of intakes to pull out the Colorado River water that keeps the city alive. This makes Las Vegas extraordinarily dependent on the level of Lake Mead, and therefore, through the chain we have traced, on the releases from Lake Powell that keep Mead from crashing. If Powell fails, and Mead falls toward its own bottom, Las Vegas is drinking from a shrinking pool that feeds a city of over 2 million people and 40 million annual visitors in the middle of one of the harshest deserts on the continent. And yet Las Vegas, more than almost any city on this list, saw this coming and acted, spending enormous sums to build a new intake deep in the bottom of Lake Mead, along with a low-level pumping station, engineered specifically so that the city could keep drawing water even if Mead fell nearly to dead pool, nearly to the very bottom. So Las Vegas presents a paradox, one of the most exposed cities by its sheer dependence on a single threatened source, and at the same time one of the best prepared, having engineered its way to keep the taps running in a scenario that would leave others dry. But preparation to draw the last of the water is not the same as having water to draw, and if the Colorado system truly collapses, if Powell can no longer feed Mead and Mead approaches empty, then all the clever engineering in the world only buys Las Vegas the ability to drink the final drops, not the water itself, which places this improbable desert city, for all its foresight, firmly in the front of the line. Las Vegas has also gone further than almost anywhere in wringing its demand down to match the threatened supply, which is the other half of its paradox. The region has waged an aggressive campaign against waste, tearing out ornamental grass, banning decorative lawns that no one walks on, paying residents to replace turf with desert landscaping, and recycling nearly all of the water used indoors, returning it to the lake to be used again and credited back against its allocation. Through these measures, it has managed to grow its population substantially while actually reducing the total amount of water it draws from the river, a genuinely impressive decoupling of growth from consumption. So Las Vegas presents perhaps the sharpest version of the whole story's central tension, a city that has done nearly everything right, cut its use, recycled its water, engineered its intakes to reach the very bottom of the lake, and yet remains acutely exposed, because all of that effort still leaves it dependent, almost totally, on a single shrinking reservoir fed by a failing upstream bank. It is proof that even exemplary management cannot substitute for water that is not there, that a city can conserve and recycle and engineer brilliantly and still find itself near the front of the line if the source it depends on simply runs too low, which is exactly the position Powell's failure threatens to put it in. The sixth city moves us to the giant of the whole system, the place that uses more Colorado River water than any other, and yet occupies a very different position in the line for a reason we must be honest about, and that city is Los Angeles. Los Angeles and the vast Southern California region around it draw a significant share of their water from the Colorado River, carried across the desert through a great aqueduct to the coastal cities where millions live. In sheer volume, Southern California is the largest user of the river's water, which would seem to place it at the very front of any list of the exposed. But here honesty requires an important distinction, because California holds a senior priority on the Colorado, a legal right that places it ahead of Arizona and Nevada in the line, meaning that when cuts are made, California is protected longer and cut later than its neighbors. So Los Angeles is not, strictly, among the first to lose its Colorado water in the priority order, and it would be misleading to suggest otherwise. It belongs on this list for a different and still serious reason, which is that its dependence on the river is so large that if Powell's failure cascades far enough to threaten even the senior California supply, the consequences would be enormous. And because Los Angeles, unlike some of its neighbors, has other major sources of water to fall back on, from distant mountains and from the state's own vast plumbing, which cushions but does not eliminate its exposure. Los Angeles is on the list as the reminder that seniority buys time, not safety, that the largest user of the river is protected only until the failure grows deep enough to overwhelm even the strongest legal rights, at which point the sheer scale of its dependence becomes a vulnerability of its own. Los Angeles also illustrates something important about how a large, wealthy region survives a shortage, which is by having more than one lifeline. The city and the vast metropolitan area around it draw not only on the Colorado, but on water carried from the mountains of the distant north through the state's own great plumbing, and on supplies brought down from the eastern Sierra, and increasingly on recycled water and captured stormwater and conservation, a diversified portfolio built precisely so that no single failure can bring the region down. That diversification is a real advantage, one that many of the cities ahead of it in line do not possess, and it is part of why Los Angeles sits later in the order, despite being the largest user of the river's water. But diversification is a cushion, not an escape, because the Colorado share is large, and the other sources have their own vulnerabilities, their own droughts and limits and legal fights, so that the loss of the river's contribution would still be a serious blow, forcing deeper cuts and harder choices even on a region with many straws and many waters. Los Angeles is the reminder that scale and wealth and diversification buy resilience and time, but that they operate within the same shrinking system, and that a deep enough failure of the Colorado reaches even the users best equipped to withstand it. The seventh city is the one within Southern California that is most acutely exposed of all, the one that imports almost everything it drinks and has the least of its own to fall back on, and that city is San Diego. San Diego sits at the far end of the pipeline, a large coastal city in a dry corner of the country with very little local water of its own. Dependent to an extraordinary degree on water imported from elsewhere, a great deal of it Colorado River water secured through major transfer agreements that move the river's water to the city. This heavy reliance on imported supply makes San Diego in some ways more precarious than its larger neighbor to the north because it has fewer alternatives. less of its own water to turn to if the imports falter. San Diego has worked hard to diversify, investing in water recycling and in desalination, turning the ocean itself into a source, precisely because it understands how dangerous its dependence on distant, threatened water really is. But those alternatives, valuable as they are, still supply only a portion of the city's needs. And a large share of its water still traces back to the Colorado, and thus to the system that Powell's failure would imperil. San Diego belongs near the front of the line not because of its priority in the legal order, which it partly shares in California's seniority, but because of the depth of its dependence on imported water and the thinness of its local alternatives. A city that must bring in nearly everything it drinks, and is therefore acutely exposed to any failure of the distant sources it relies upon. San Diego's turn to the ocean is the clearest sign of how seriously the most exposed cities take this threat, because desalination is a measure of near desperation, the choice of a city that has looked at its dependence on distant, failing water, and concluded it must manufacture water from the sea, whatever the cost. Turning seawater into drinking water is enormously expensive and energy intensive, the option of last resort for a place with no better choices, and San Diego built one of the largest such plants in the country precisely because it understood, earlier and more acutely than most, how dangerous its reliance on imported Colorado water really was. Yet even that dramatic step supplies only a fraction of the city's needs, and the great majority of its water still comes from elsewhere, much of it from the river, so that for all its investment in recycling and desalination, San Diego remains bound to the Colorado, and thus to the system Powell's failure threatens. It is a city trying hard to escape a trap it can see closing, spending heavily to build alternatives, and still finding that the trap is larger than its escape, that the depth of its dependence on imported water cannot be undone quickly enough to outrun the failure bearing down from upstream. San Diego is the front of the line's most anxious member, working hardest to get out and still unable to fully do so. The eighth and final city carries the story across an international border and reminds us that the Colorado River sustains not one nation but two, and that some of the most vulnerable people who depend on it live where the river's water is scarcest and its politics most fraught. That city is Tijuana, in Mexico. Under a long-standing treaty, the United States is obligated to deliver a share of the Colorado River's water to Mexico, and that water sustains cities and farms in the Mexican borderlands, including the large and rapidly growing city of Tijuana, which draws heavily on Colorado River water carried to it through a system of canals and aqueducts. Tijuana is deeply dependent on this supply, with limited local alternatives. And it sits at the very end of the river's long journey, in the position where any shortage upstream is felt with particular force, because the water must pass through everyone else's hands before it reaches the border. If Powell's failure cascades down through the entire system, shrinking the flow that reaches the lower basin, the water delivered across the border comes under pressure. And a city like Tijuana, already straining to supply a booming population in an arid land, faces a threat to the foundation of its water supply that it has little ability to replace. Tijuana stands on this list as the reminder that the failure of Lake Powell is not only an American crisis, that the river binds two countries together in dependence on the same shrinking source, and that the people at the very end of the line, across the border, in the driest and most politically complicated corner of the whole system, are among the most exposed of all when the water begins to fail. And Tijuana's exposure is sharpened by the sheer speed of its growth and the fragility of its position, because it is a booming border city. Swelling with people drawn by the factories and the border economy, its population climbing faster than its water infrastructure can comfortably keep pace with even in good times. It already struggles with water stress, with neighborhoods that receive water intermittently, with an aging and overstretched supply system straining to serve a rapidly expanding city in an arid land. Onto that already precarious situation, the failure of the Colorado upstream would land with particular force because Tijuana sits at the very tail of the entire system, dependent on water that must survive the demands of every user above it before a share is delivered across the border, so that any shortage anywhere upstream is concentrated and magnified by the time it reaches the border city at the end of the road. And because it lies across an international boundary, its fate is entangled in the politics of two nations, in treaties and negotiations over which it has limited control, its water supply hostage to decisions made far away in another country's capital. Tijuana is the front of the line's most vulnerable member in some ways, a fast-growing, water-stressed city at the very end of a failing river, holding the weakest hand in the highest stakes game. So step back now and look at the shape of the whole line, because the order of these 8 cities tells a story that is as important as the cities themselves. At the very front stands Page, exposed directly and physically, drinking from the shrinking lake itself, its fate tied not to any law, but to the simple question of whether its intake stays underwater. Behind Page comes the cluster of Arizona cities, Phoenix and Tucson and Scottsdale, exposed through the junior priority that puts them first in line for cuts, and through their dependence on the Colorado water that Powell's failure would choke off before it ever reached them. Then comes Las Vegas, staking its desert existence on a single lake and engineering desperately to keep drawing from it to the last. Then the great California cities, Los Angeles and San Diego, protected for a time by California's senior rights, but exposed by the sheer depth of their dependence, especially San Diego, which imports almost everything it drinks. And finally Tijuana, across the border, at the very end of the river, where any failure upstream arrives with compounded force. The line runs from the shore of the lake outward through the priority system, and down the length of the river to the sea, and across an international boundary, and it reveals that who loses water first is decided by a combination of raw geography and a century of law. The physical fact of where your intake sits, and the legal fact of where your right stands in the queue. Notice, too, that almost nothing about this order can be changed by the cities themselves, which is part of what makes it so unnerving. A city cannot vote itself a more senior water right, cannot move its intake to a fuller lake, cannot rewrite the century of law that placed it where it stands in the queue. The order was set long ago, by treaties and compacts and the accidents of geography, by decisions made generations before most of the people now, depending on the river, were born. And it now governs their fate with a rigidity that no amount of local effort can easily undo. The cities can conserve, diversify, build alternatives, and buy time. And those things matter at the margins. But their fundamental position in the line, first or last, protected or exposed, is largely fixed, inherited beyond their reach, which means that when the water fails, it will fail them in an order they did not choose and cannot escape. It is important to be honest and careful about what all of this does and does not mean, because the reality is serious enough without exaggeration, and getting it wrong in either direction does a disservice. It does not mean that on the day Lake Powell reaches dead pool, all 8 of these cities instantly go dry, their taps producing nothing, their people fleeing into the desert. Every one of these cities has more than one source of water, has reserves and alternatives and sophisticated management, has the ability to ration and to stretch and to buy time, and the failure, when it comes, will be a matter of losing a share, a large and vital share, rather than losing everything overnight. Nor does it mean that this outcome is certain or imminent in its most extreme form, because there is still the possibility of wet years that buy time, of agreements that cut usage and slow the decline, of emergency measures and new supplies. But it also does not mean, in the other direction, that this is alarmism or fantasy, because the reservoirs really are at record lows. The thresholds really are being approached. The priority system really does place these cities in this order, and the dependence really is as deep as described. The truth is the sober middle, that these 8 cities are the most exposed in the system, that they would lose their Colorado water in something like this order as Powell fails, that for some it would be a manageable if painful blow, and for others a threat to the very foundation of their water supply, and that the failure driving it all is not a distant hypothetical, but a process already, advanced and accelerating. It is worth being concrete about what losing that share of water actually forces a city to do, because the crisis does not announce itself as empty taps, but as a cascade of harder and harder choices. First come the restrictions, the bans on watering lawns and washing cars and filling pools, the appeals for conservation, the tightening of the rules around every non-essential use. Then come the price signals, the rising cost of water as the scarce supply is rationed by expense, falling hardest on those who can least afford it. Then come the deeper measures, the buying of water from farmers who follow their fields and sell their allocations to the cities, the frantic investment in expensive alternatives like desalination and recycling, the emergency deals and the political fights over who must give up what. And beneath it all runs the threat to growth itself, because a city that cannot secure water for new development must eventually stop growing, and a region built entirely on the promise of endless expansion finds that promise broken, its economy and its identity forced to change. This is what it means for one of these cities to lose its Colorado water, not a single dramatic day of dry taps, but a long grinding descent through restriction and cost and painful adaptation. The slow reshaping of a whole way of life around the disappearance of a supply that was always taken for granted. And it is that descent, city by city, that Powell's failure sets in motion down the length of the line, and underneath all of it lies the reason the failure is happening at all, the force that turns this from a temporary drought into a permanent reckoning, which is the long-term drying of the Colorado River basin under a warming climate. The river is carrying less water than it used to, year after year, in a decline that scientists increasingly describe not as a passing drought, but as a fundamental shift to a drier state, even as the population depending on the river keeps growing and the demands upon it keep rising. A river carrying less water, divided among users entitled by old agreements to more than it holds, drains its great reservoirs to sustain the gap. And Powell and Mead are those reservoirs, the buffers absorbing the difference between what the river delivers and what the basin consumes, and they are running down, because that difference has become structural and permanent. So, the failure of Lake Powell is not an accident or a run of bad luck. It is the visible symptom of a deeper imbalance. A basin that is promised and built and grown beyond what its shrinking river can sustain, and the 8 cities at the front of the line are simply the first places where that imbalance will translate into the concrete reality of water that is no longer there. And it is worth widening the lens one final time, because these 8 cities are only the front of a line that stretches far behind them. And the failure of Lake Powell is ultimately a threat to something much larger than any list of names. The Colorado River sustains something on the order of 40 million people across the American Southwest and northern Mexico, irrigates some of the most productive farmland on the continent, supplies the water and much of the power for one of the fastest growing and most economically vital regions in the two countries, a whole civilization raised in the desert on the strength of this one river. The 8 cities at the front of the line are simply where the failure becomes visible first, the leading edge of a crisis that, if it deepens, reaches back through the entire basin into every city and farm and community that draws on the river, into the food supply that depends on its irrigated fields, into the economy that the water and the power together make possible. To lose the river is not merely to inconvenience 8 cities. It is to pull the foundation out from under a region built on the assumption that the water would always be there. A region that grew, boomed, and prospered on a river that is now delivering less than it promises and falling toward the point where its great reservoirs can no longer hide the gap. The front of the line is where we can see the failure clearly, but the whole line, the whole basin, the whole improbable desert civilization stands behind those 8 cities, waiting on the same falling number on the same distant wall. So return, at the end, to that line of cities and see it for what it is, a queue of the exposed arranged by geography and by law, waiting on the level of a reservoir in the canyon country that is falling toward the point where it can no longer keep them supplied. Page on the shore, its intake creeping toward the surface. Phoenix and Tucson and Scottsdale in the desert, first in line for the cuts. Las Vegas drinking from its shrinking lake. Los Angeles and San Diego on the coast, protected for now but dependent to the bone. Tijuana across the border, at the very end of the river's long road. These are the 8 that lose their water first when Lake Powell fails, and the order in which they stand is a map of how the great crisis of the Colorado will actually unfold. Not all at once and everywhere, but city by city, down the line, in the order that geography and history have already written. The reservoir is at its lowest point ever and still falling, and the line is not a prediction of some far-off future. It is a description of the order of a failure that has already begun,